The space race became one of the most striking fronts of the Cold War between the USSR and the United States. Both superpowers were determined to be first in everything and prove their supremacy to the world. "It'll be far better than racing to build deadly weapons," one American commentator remarked. The Soviet Union took an early lead in the late 1950s, launching the world's first artificial satellite and giving humanity its first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin. Following these milestones, the USSR achieved several more firsts: the first multi-person space mission, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and the first ever spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. Yet one prize remained untouched: the moon. Determined not to fall behind, the Americans threw every available resource into a lunar program, culminating in the historic landing of astronauts on the moon on July 20th, 1969. But why did the US manage to take the lead in the moon race? Did they really land there? Or was it, as some claim, a cleverly staged Hollywood production? And why did the Soviet lunar program never reach its goal? We'll explore all of this today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Theory of Everything, and hit the notification bell to uncover even more mysteries from history. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet R-7 rocket launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome, carrying the world's first satellite into orbit. Just a month later, the USSR sent the first animal, Laika the dog, into space. Despite her death from overheating, the mission proved that living beings could survive in orbit and microgravity. These launches were a massive strategic victory for the USSR. The United States had lost its first mover advantage and now had to catch up at any cost. On July 29, 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, officially creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The agency's mission: send a human into orbit around the Earth, a logical step in space exploration where the US still had a chance to surpass the Soviets. NASA immediately launched Project Mercury, its first manned spaceflight program. Candidate selection began almost immediately, even before the spacecraft and launch vehicle were fully ready. Meanwhile, the USSR continued advancing, launching the unmanned interplanetary probe Lunar 1, which passed roughly 6,000 kilometers from the Moon and entered solar orbit, the first spacecraft to escape Earth's gravity. On September 14, 1959, Lunar 2 became the first human-made object to reach the Moon's surface, and less than a month later, Lunar 3 transmitted the first ever images of the Moon's far side, previously hidden from Earth. Thanks to the progress of Soviet science and culture, the Moon unveiled itself, revealing its face to Soviet scientists and the world, a contemporary commentator noted. However, Lunar 3 marked the last major success in the Soviet unmanned program for a long period. This allowed the Americans to narrow the gap. At the same time, the USSR achieved significant progress in manned spaceflight, culminating in Yuri Gagarin, the first human to orbit Earth on April 12, 1961, aboard Vostok 1, safely returning to the Saratov region. Gagarin's flight was a stunning blow to American pride. President John F. Kennedy expressed cautious congratulations, noting that U.S. space exploration was far behind. Both nations also recognized that space technology was directly linked to military power, making space leadership a symbol of strategic supremacy. To land a human on the Moon, NASA had to tackle several enormous challenges. First, They needed a rocket capable of escaping Earth's gravity while carrying several tons of payload. Second, they had to photograph the moon's surface and create detailed maps to identify the safest landing sites, and even collect soil samples for scientific study. Third, astronauts needed extensive test flights, first in Earth orbit and then near the moon. To achieve this, the US government poured enormous resources into the program. From 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget increased nearly fivefold, and around 100,000 people were involved in the effort. The agency quickly developed a complete lineup of launch vehicles, from the Titan II, which carried the two-man maneuverable Gemini spacecraft into orbit, to the mighty Saturn V, capable of sending the three-man Apollo spacecraft directly to the moon. Between 1966 and 1967, 5 unmanned American missions flew to the moon, providing a full picture of what astronauts would face on the lunar surface. Starting in February 1966, NASA began unmanned Apollo test flights, with the first crewed launch planned for January 1967. Tragically, during ground testing, a fire broke out aboard the spacecraft. 3 astronauts, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, lost their lives, delaying manned Apollo missions by a year and a half. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was not going to give up the moon, but their manned program started 3 years later, in 1964. Unlike the Americans, who focused entirely on Apollo, the USSR pursued multiple competing lunar projects led by rival design bureaus: OKB-1, led by Sergei Korolev; OKB-52, led by Vladimir Chelomey; OKB-586, led by Mikhail Yangel. Each bureau developed its own plan for a super-heavy rocket capable of reaching the moon. The result was precious time lost, skyrocketing costs, and scattered priorities. Eventually, Korolev's design, the N-1 rocket, was chosen for further development. But in 1966, Korolev passed away, leaving the manned lunar program without a strong leader. Soon after, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, a top candidate for a moon mission, died in a tragic test flight. Despite these setbacks, the Soviet unmanned program continued. On February 3, 1966, Luna 9 became the first spacecraft in history to soft land on the moon and transmit panoramic images of its surface to Earth. In April, Luna 10 became the first artificial satellite of the moon. Soviet engineers also sent living creatures to the moon. In September 1968, Zond 5 carried 2 Central Asian tortoises around the moon and back safely, earning a spot in the Guinness World Records. A year later, Zond 7 took the first color photographs of the lunar surface. First humans on the moon. When it became known that Soviet tortoises had orbited the moon, Americans realized that a human could be next, and that it might not be an American. We launched 5 or 6 unmanned missions that worked beautifully and returned safely. Officials kept asking, "Let's try again, one more." But there wasn't anyone like Korolev to say, "We're ready, let's go for a manned flight." Determined not to finish second again, NASA rushed to launch Apollo 7 into Earth orbit in October 1968. A few months later, on December 24, 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft to orbit the moon, with Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders aboard. We were the first 3 humans to leave Earth and be captured by another celestial body. For the first time, 3 people saw the moon's far side, and for the first time, we saw Earth from 240,000 miles away. Meanwhile, in the USSR, test flights of the N-1 rocket began. The first launch, in February 1969, exploded just seconds after liftoff, confirming that a manned lunar landing was at least postponed. American astronauts kept advancing. In March 1969, the Apollo 9 crew successfully tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. In May, Apollo 10 completed the same tests in lunar orbit. The Soviets faced another disaster on July 3, 1969, when a second N-1 rocket exploded. 2,500 tons of fuel burned in a white flame, lighting the night step for miles, remembered Boris Chertok, a Soviet engineer. Just 13 days later, on July 16, 1969, a Saturn V rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral, carrying Apollo 11 and its crew of test pilots, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The mission proceeded smoothly, and after 76 hours, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin boarded the lunar module, separating from the command module, where Collins would remain in orbit. The first 2 hours on the moon were spent preparing for an emergency ascent, just in case. During this time, Aldrin, a devout Presbyterian, performed the first communion on the moon, taking part in a sacred ritual in space. Then, both astronauts stepped onto the lunar surface, making history. Moonwalk, triumphs, science, and conspiracy theories. Astronauts spent about 2.5 hours on the moon's surface. Around 650 million people watched them live on television. Only 5 countries, the Soviet Union, East Germany, China, North Korea, and South Vietnam, ignored the broadcast. Armstrong and Aldrin explored the lunar terrain, took thousands of photographs, collected 21.5 kilograms of lunar rock, and set up several scientific instruments. These included a seismometer to measure moonquakes and retroreflectors for laser measurements of the distance between the moon and Earth. What a desolate place we've landed. There's no life here, no colors. Until you get down and look closely at the minerals in the rocks, everything is covered in this fine dust. The astronauts also planted the American flag and left a plaque reading, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon, July 1969. AD. We came in peace for all mankind." They even spoke with President Richard Nixon by telephone from the moon. The return journey was smooth. Apollo 11 safely splash-landed in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. Following Apollo 11, a series of successful missions continued. Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. In total, 12 American astronauts walked on the moon, surveyed the terrain, installed scientific instruments, collected soil samples, and tested lunar rovers. Only Apollo 13 ran into trouble. An oxygen tank exploded en route to the moon. NASA engineers worked tirelessly to ensure the astronauts returned safely to Earth. The moon hoax conspiracy. Soon after Apollo 11, rumors spread suggesting the moon landing was the greatest hoax in history. Skeptics claimed the live broadcast watched by millions was actually a Hollywood production. Conspiracy theories suggested Stanley Kubrick, who released 2001, A Space Odyssey a year earlier, had filmed a realistic fake moon landing, perfectly capturing weightlessness and artificial gravity. In 2003, Kubrick's widow added fuel to the fire in a TV documentary called The Dark Side of the Moon, claiming Americans never landed on the moon. However, the film was a fictional mockumentary, and the disclaimer clearly indicated it was not factual. In 2015, a man resembling Kubrick allegedly gave an interview claiming he faked the moon landings for NASA. He supposedly said, "I committed a huge fraud against the American public. The fake moon landings were staged with the US government and NASA. I was the one who filmed it." This claim was quickly debunked. The story was poorly executed and widely recognized as false. Kubrick's widow later confirmed the interview was a hoax. Despite this, conspiracy theories persisted. For decades, skeptics cited the same evidence. The American flag on the moon appears to flutter, which shouldn't happen in the vacuum of space. Stars are missing in lunar photographs. Shadows appear inconsistent, as if the sun were not the only light source. Astronauts supposedly would have died from lethal radiation levels. Each of these points has a logical explanation. The flag was mounted on an L-shaped aluminum pole, creating folds that caused it to appear as though it fluttered. The motion stopped once the energy from planting it dissipated. Stars do not appear in photos because the sunlit lunar surface is extremely bright, making stars too faint to be captured. Shadows were long and distorted because astronauts landed when the sun was near the horizon, just like on Earth at sunrise or sunset. Uneven terrain exaggerated these effects. NASA spacecraft had adequate radiation shielding, keeping astronauts safe. The Apollo legacy and the new lunar race. During the Apollo missions, astronauts were protected from dangerous radiation belts by the thick walls of the command module. The flight path was carefully planned to avoid the regions with the highest radiation. Today, most experts, both Russian and international, consider the moon landing conspiracy theories nothing more than pseudo-scientific nonsense. We have always had systems to track launches, Earth orbit flights, lunar transfers, course corrections, and everything happening on the moon. It's absurd to think otherwise. It's either ignorance or some anti-American sentiment. Recent photographs also confirm the moon landings. In April 2021, India's Chandrayaan-2 spacecraft sent back images clearly showing the Apollo 11 landing module. Later, in February 2022, Chandrayaan captured the Apollo 12 landing site. The post-Apollo era, both the US and the Soviet Union once envisioned grand lunar bases. The Soviets developed a project called Zvezda, which included mock-ups of expedition vehicles and crewed modules. However, disagreements in the Politburo over space priorities prevented the project from ever taking off. By the early 1970s, Americans had largely lost interest in the moon, having fulfilled their space ambitions and overtaken the USSR. Similarly, Soviet engineers focused on uncrewed lunar rovers like Lunokhod, which explored the lunar surface and collected soil samples. Costs of lunar ambition. The United States spent approximately $24.5 billion on the Apollo program, equivalent to $253 billion today. That sum could have built 48 modern international trade centers or 100 four-story skyscrapers with offices, shops, and restaurants. The cost of the Soviet lunar program is harder to estimate due to the secret nature of military and space budgets. Informal estimates suggest it was about 5 times cheaper than the American effort. Lunar Race 2.0. While the early space race participants focused on earthly concerns, interest in the moon resurfaced in China. In 2004, China launched its lunar program, Chang'e. Today, China has nearly matched the achievements of the US and USSR from half a century ago, except for a crewed moon landing, which is planned for 2030. The next step for China is a robotic research station on the moon's south pole in collaboration with Russia. It is intended to operate without humans. A full crewed base is not yet on the agenda. Russia, meanwhile, has revived its lunar program. The first spacecraft, launched in 2023, crashed due to a calculation error, but a repeat mission is planned soon. India has also joined the lunar race. In 2009, Chandrayaan-1 made the first hard landing in the moon's south polar region. 2023, India achieved the first ever soft landing in the lunar polar region. US returns to the moon. The United States re-entered the lunar race in 2017 with the Artemis program. Initially focused on commercial resource extraction, the mission now aims to establish a permanent lunar settlement, laying the groundwork for future Mars exploration. A unique aspect of this new lunar race is the involvement of private companies. American entrepreneur Elon Musk, founder of SpaceX, plans to send humans to the moon within 5 years and to Mars within 7 to 9 years. We want to preserve a spark of consciousness on Earth, expand it to Mars, then to the rest of the solar system, and eventually to other star systems. SpaceX, along with Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, is developing lunar landers for the Artemis program. The future of lunar exploration. Who will win the 21st century lunar race? Is building a human base on the moon worthwhile? How soon will humans step foot on other planets? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more insights. The journey into space is far from over.